Most people believe that colon cancer begins with intense pain, something impossible to ignore. But this is one of the most dangerous misconceptions about the disease. Colorectal cancer, in most cases, develops silently. It does not announce itself with sharp pain or dramatic symptoms. It starts with small, gradual changes that are easily blamed on stress, a poor week of eating, or aging. And that is exactly why so many diagnoses happen too late. The most alarming data today is not just the overall incidence of the disease, but the age group in which it is rising the fastest. Adults between 20 and 50 years old are being diagnosed with colon cancer at rates that did not exist a few decades ago. This did not happen because human DNA suddenly changed. Genetics do not transform in a single generation. What changed was the internal environment of the human body. The modern gut lives under a set of pressures completely different from those experienced by previous generations. The intestine is one of the most sensitive systems in the body. It responds directly to diet quality, physical activity, frequent antibiotic use, chronic stress, poor sleep, and overall metabolic health. When this ecosystem begins to lose balance, the body starts sending early warning signals. The problem is that almost no one has been taught how to recognize them. The first of these signs often appears far from the intestine itself, which is exactly why it goes unnoticed. We are talking about iron deficiency anemia. Many people discover anemia during routine blood tests, are given iron supplements, and move on. What is rarely investigated is why iron is being lost in the first place. In adults, especially outside the context of pregnancy or significant menstrual bleeding, iron deficiency anemia almost never appears without a cause. In the context of colorectal cancer, anemia is often the result of slow, continuous bleeding somewhere in the gastrointestinal tract. Unlike acute bleeding, this type of blood loss is microscopic. There is no pain, no visible blood in the toilet, no immediate alarm. Small amounts of blood are lost day after day, for months or even years, until iron stores are depleted and the blood's oxygen-carrying capacity becomes insufficient. The result is persistent fatigue, difficulty concentrating, shortness of breath with effort, and a constant feeling that the body never fully recovers. This subtle bleeding occurs because tumors develop their own network of blood vessels. These vessels are structurally fragile. They do not require major trauma to rupture. Simple friction from harder stools can be enough to cause microbleeding. Because this bleeding happens inside the intestine, it goes unnoticed. The body adapts until it no longer can. Over time, this same process contributes to the second important sign: persistent, disproportionate fatigue. This is not the normal tiredness after a long day. It is an exhaustion that does not improve with rest. Even after sleeping, the person wakes up tired. Part of this can be explained by anemia, but not all of it. Tumors are metabolically active tissue. They release inflammatory substances that directly interfere with mitochondrial function, the structures responsible for energy production inside cells. When inflammation becomes chronic, the body enters a forced energy-saving mode. It produces less energy, preserves less muscle, and begins operating at its limit. This type of fatigue is often normalized. It is blamed on stress, aging, or workload. Few people consider that the body may be quietly fighting a much more serious process. Another early sign is a subtle change in stool appearance. This does not necessarily mean visible blood. In many cases, what occurs is a slight darkening that is easy to miss unless someone is paying close attention. When small amounts of blood mix with stool and travel through a longer portion of the intestine, that blood breaks down. The result is a darker coloration that blends into the normal stool pattern and goes unnoticed. There is no bright red color, no visual shock. That is why simple stool tests can detect what the eye cannot see. This bleeding is also not constant. It can occur in phases. During periods of slower bowel transit and harder stools, friction increases and bleeding resumes. During periods of easier bowel movements, bleeding may temporarily stop. This intermittent pattern creates a false sense of normalcy and further delays investigation. As the process progresses, changes in bowel function begin to appear. Tumors do not affect only the physical space inside the intestine. They interfere with local neurological communication. The gut has its own nervous system, responsible for coordinating movement, fluid secretion, and absorption. When chronic inflammation or local compression is present, this system begins to malfunction. The result can be unexplained changes in bowel habits. Some people begin to have more frequent bowel movements. Others become constipated. In some cases, there is an alternation between the two extremes. Inflammation also alters how water is handled inside the intestine. More inflammation can mean looser stools. Reduced water release can lead to harder stools. The previous pattern disappears and the person no longer recognizes their own digestive rhythm. This situation does not arise in isolation. It reflects profound changes in modern lifestyle. Gut microbiome diversity has declined dramatically over recent decades. Ultra-processed diets low in real fiber, combined with frequent antibiotic use, have reduced the variety of beneficial bacteria. At the same time, physical inactivity has increased, sitting has become excessive, and chronic stress has become constant. The intestine is directly affected by this ongoing inflammatory environment. A symptom that often accompanies these changes is increased gas, abdominal bloating, and early satiety. The person eats small amounts and already feels full. This can happen because a growing tumor begins to occupy space inside the intestine, creating a partial obstruction. Transit slows down, fermentation increases, and gas production rises. The slower the transit, the greater the fermentation, and the greater the discomfort. Additionally, when the intestine cannot properly process its contents, it sends early satiety signals as a protective mechanism. The body tries to prevent overload in a system that is already compromised. Early on, this symptom is rarely associated with anything serious. It is usually interpreted as poor digestion or food sensitivity. All of these signs have something in common. They are not dramatic. They do not immediately disrupt daily life, but they represent real changes in how the body functions. A healthy intestine is predictable, efficient, and quiet. When it becomes unpredictable, slow, inflamed, or excessively reactive, it never happens without a reason. Ignoring these signs does not make them disappear. It only allows the process to continue outside of awareness. Recognizing these early changes is what separates an early diagnosis from a late discovery. In the next block, we will move into even more specific signs, those linked to the mechanics of the intestine and the structural progression of the problem, signs that many people experience for months before seeking help. Functional changes in the intestine do not occur in isolation. As the process advances, signs related directly to the mechanics of bowel evacuation begin to appear, and these are often even more ignored because many people feel embarrassed to talk about them or simply get used to the sensation. One of these signs is a constant feeling of urgency to have a bowel movement, even when there is very little stool to pass. The person feels an immediate need to go to the bathroom, sometimes with discomfort or pain, but the result is minimal or non-existent. Shortly afterward, the urge returns, accompanied by the sensation that the bowel movement was never complete. This pattern is known as tenesmus and is frequently associated with lesions located in the final portions of the large intestine. This happens because the intestine has highly sensitive stretch receptors, especially in the rectum and the final segment of the sigmoid colon. Under normal conditions, these receptors are only activated when there is enough stool volume ready to be eliminated. But when there is a space-occupying lesion, such as a tumor, these receptors are stimulated continuously and inappropriately. The brain interprets this stimulation as a signal to evacuate, even when the intestine is not full. The result is a false, repetitive, and frustrating urgency. This type of sign often appears months before any intense pain or visible bleeding. Many people spend long periods adjusting their diet, using laxatives, or assuming they have irritable bowel syndrome, without realizing that the problem is not the intestinal contents, but the structure the intestine is trying to move around. Another important sign is a persistent change in stool shape. This is not an isolated episode, but a pattern that repeats week after week. Stools become thinner and elongated, sometimes described as pencil thin. When this happens consistently, it indicates that something is reducing the available space inside the intestine. The body tries to adapt. If the passage is partially blocked, the intestine may release more water to soften the stool and allow it to pass through a narrower opening. This explains why, in many cases, stool narrowing is accompanied by looser stools or episodes of diarrhea alternating with constipation. This alternation is not random. It reflects the body's continuous attempt to work around a progressive obstruction. As this obstruction becomes more significant, bowel patterns may become even more chaotic. Prolonged periods of constipation are followed by explosive bowel movements, often accompanied by mucus. The irritated and inflamed intestine begins secreting fluids as a defensive response. To an outside observer, this may look like a dysregulated gut. To the body, it is a clear warning that something is physically interfering with intestinal transit. In more advanced stages, bleeding is no longer microscopic. Blood becomes visible in the toilet bowl or on toilet paper. When the lesion is close to the anal opening, the blood tends to appear bright red because it does not travel far enough to break down. In other cases, heavier bleeding simply moves too quickly through the intestine to darken. The major problem is that this sign is almost always attributed to hemorrhoids. And hemorrhoids are indeed extremely common. But this automatic assumption causes many people to live with recurrent bleeding for months or years without proper investigation. Tumors, by their very nature, are disorganized tissue. Unlike healthy tissue, they lack stable structure. As they grow, they become increasingly fragile. Minor stimuli are enough to trigger bleeding. In addition, as the tumor grows, it not only bleeds more easily, but also begins to interfere systemically with the body's metabolism. One of the most concerning signs at this stage is rapid, unintentional weight loss. This is not gradual weight loss from lifestyle changes. It happens without effort, even when eating habits have not changed. This occurs through several mechanisms happening at the same time. Tumors release inflammatory substances that disrupt hormonal balance, reduce appetite, and increase muscle breakdown. The body enters a state of hypermetabolism, burning energy at an accelerated rate while losing the ability to rebuild tissue. At the same time, the tumor aggressively consumes nutrients, diverting resources that should support muscles, organs, and the immune system. When the intestine is compromised, nutrient absorption also deteriorates. Even if a person is eating, the body cannot properly absorb proteins, fats, vitamins, and minerals. This combination leads to progressive loss of muscle mass, strength, and vitality. In more advanced stages, this condition can progress into a syndrome known as cachexia, characterized by severe weight loss, extreme weakness, and a marked decline in quality of life. It is important to understand that none of these signs appear suddenly or in isolation. They are part of a progression. The body tries to compensate, adapt, and warn repeatedly before it begins to fail. The problem is that culturally, we have learned to normalize digestive symptoms. Bloating, bowel changes, fatigue, and discomfort have become accepted as part of modern life, when in reality, they are clear biological messages of imbalance. Colorectal cancer is not an automatic death sentence when identified early. On the contrary, when diagnosed in its initial stages, treatment success rates are high. The real danger lies in ignoring symptoms that persist, change pattern, or intensify over time. A healthy intestine works quietly. It does not demand attention. When it begins to speak repeatedly, something needs to be investigated. Listening to these signals is not paranoia. It is biological intelligence. The body always speaks before it screams. The challenge is learning to listen while there is still time. If this video helped you understand how the body gives early warning signs, share it with someone who cares about their health, and subscribe to the channel. This is where we help you recognize problems before they become diseases.